as it will be what we can give. So, was it the best of time? Was it the worst of time? We don't know, and we will not summarize. But certainly, we are at a time when things are changing. For those of you who attended the previous session earlier today with Sir David, we are under no illusion that nature itself is changing dramatically. We know that technologies are changing the way we work, the way we relate to each other, the way we transact, the way we effect payment. So all those trends, and I've only mentioned two of them, are going to critically impact the way in which we at the IMF serve the membership and the type of services that we offer to our country members. We call it surveillance. It's a bit of a strange word. I've always thought that we were spying when we were doing surveillance. We're not really spying, we're trying to help. And what we will try with this fantastic panel today is, first of all, have them identify what they see as the major trends that are going to shape our future and that are going to have an impact on the mission of the fund, which has to do with procuring as much financial stability and facilitating growth and prosperity through different tools. So that is going to be the first question I will ask each of them. And in order to understand how those trends that they will identify, I will then ask them how we can do a better job. How did you like it? How would you like it? So that's the purpose of the exercise. Anybody who is not interested in those matters, please go and seek fortune elsewhere. But if you're here, you're interested, and I will give you the floor, because at the end of our session, we will take 10 minutes. So if you have questions, be prepared and hang in here. So, I will introduce my panel members for those of you who don't know them. As I said, we are unbelievably privileged to have with us, to my left, Sir John Cunliffe, Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. He has specific responsibility for financial stability. He's also a member of the G20 Financial Stability Board Steering Committee and the European Systemic Risk Board. To his left is Oksana Markarova, who is the Minister of Finance of Ukraine and has worked in the Ministry of Finance of Ukraine since joining the public service in 2015. Her prior experience included leading a premier Ukrainian investment firm. Next to her is Ahmed Shide, who is the Minister of Finance of Ethiopia. Minister Shide has held other positions in the Ethiopian government, including as Minister of Transportation and as State Minister of Finance and Economic Development. To his left is Siv Jensen, who has been Minister of Finance of Norway since 2013 and is the leader of the Progress Party since 2006. And finally, Professor Yiping Wang, who is Professor of Economics and Deputy Dean of the National School of Development at Beijing University, or Peking University. Professor Wang served until recently as a member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the People's Bank of China, and he's also a member of the External Advisory Group for the IMF's 2020 Comprehensive Surveillance Review. So you can tell from their pedigree and their various titles that they are exquisitely qualified to actually have a view on trends and advise on how we can improve surveillance going forward. And they've allowed me to call them by their first name. So I dispense with Sir, Professor, Minister. John, I'm giving you the floor. You have 2.5 minutes to give me the trends.
It's always difficult to predict and to forecast the future. And there are clearly trends in demographics, climate change, technological change that are going to shape, they're already shaping our world, and the way they interact will have an impact. But I just wanted to concentrate on political trends which is unusual for a central banker. Because on the other trends, on climate change, demography, technology, I know which direction the trend is going. I don't know how it will impact on the macroeconomy. I don't know whether will be longer lifespans will be accompanied by longer working lives or just more illness at the end. But at least I know where the trend is going. The politics and the political composition in advanced and emerging countries has changed very fast in the last 5 years. Europe, I think, depending how you define it, 25% of voters voted for populist parties in previous elections, up from 7 or 8% 9 or 10 years ago. And the thing about that trend is one doesn't know, have we plateaued? Will it continue? Will it accelerate? Or are we at an inflection point, or at the point at which it reverses? And of course, these new parties have brought new perspectives, new policies, new ways of looking at the world, and it's already started to have an economic impact. So for 5 or 6 years after the crisis, economics drove the politics. Now politics is driving the economics. You can see it in trade, you can see it in the prospects of fragmentation of the world economy and around the architecture that we have for the governance of the world economy. And I think the great uncertainty is, as I say, will that continue? The reason seems to be clear, that a large section of the electorate is alienated from the political, feels alienated from the political and economic system. But the question is, will that grow? Will it reverse? Are we on the point of finding the answers to bring the system to the people and the people back to the system? Or have we reached some new sour and divisive normal that's going to continue? And that, for me, is the biggest question overhanging the world economy at the moment.
Okay, so you focused on political trend, and there's no better person to succeed you as a representative of Ukraine, who is clearly going through an election at the moment where the lead incumbent is actually, well, I'll leave it to you to characterize who he is. I won't say, but it might be an illustration of what John is saying. So,
thank you, Christine. I think if we're looking at the trends, obviously there are a number of changing realities that we have to face. I would like to focus on the three which I think have the global impact, but we can clearly see it in Ukraine as well. The first one is migration. And when we say about migration, it's not only the migration of people, even though migration of people has become, I think, the key opportunity, but also the key problem for a number of nations. And we see it in Ukraine with a lot of people migrating to Poland and to other countries. It's migration of capital and specifically the migration of profits. We also see it in Ukraine, and we see the need of new joint efforts if we want to develop and create values in our countries and also tax them property in our countries, but also continue the cooperation. It's the migration of problems as well. There has been problems which were country specifics before, but we now see that a number of problems are becoming the problems that we export to each other because our economies and our political systems are becoming very interrelated. The second big trend is the continuing digital technological disruption, innovation, and specifically the open data, which again is a big source of innovation and a big source of new development. And it has been in Ukraine. Ukraine been developing the FinTech, the agri-tech, and been at the forefront. But it also poses a lot of new questions which we need to answer. Do we protect the data sufficiently? Do we protect our systems from manipulations from either inside or from within? And we saw it in a number of elections, not only in Ukraine, but in other countries. And more importantly, I think, is we have to think about the future, about our children, who now get access to large data, large information, even before they develop the critical thinking tools. Are they prepared to process this data correctly and make the decisions they will be making in 10, 15, 20 years at the next elections? And that leads me to the third trend, which I see everywhere, but also in Ukraine, is the rise of populism. And this anti-establishment sentiment, which we see in politics, but not only in politics. And how do we, as leaders or technocrats or managers or political leaders, how do we cope with it, and how do we still lead the change, and how do we still push for the necessary reforms in the situation when our citizens demand the fast food solutions, they want them yesterday, and they are ready for the change sometimes without analyzing truly whether this change will bring what they are truly looking for. So I think these three combined is, shaping the new reality in which we have to find the new solution. We have to embrace this change in order to find the solution for this new reality.
Thank you very much, Oksana. Thank you. You've also mentioned populism and the issue of data and use of it, the cross-border impact of some of the trends that we're seeing, and clearly migration, both in terms of people and capital. Ahmed, what do you see?
Good, Christian. Thank you. Global growth and consumption in general is key for Africa and for least developing countries. Africa, and also Ethiopia in particular, has tremendous economic potential. Some of the fastest growing economies globally are in Africa. As a continent, and as also my country, Ethiopia, our most important priority, number one, number two, number three, are jobs, jobs, jobs. We need to create millions of jobs because there is a demographic pressure. Unemployed youngs are exploding. Given the large number we are talking about, the demographic trajectory in Africa is of something of global consequence if we have to address. It's a potential, but also it's a threat if we don't use that dividend. Yeah. From the perspective of developing countries, demographic trends, labor issues, and the role technology play in growth and labor market development are important to look at. These two could potentially have significant influence in the global economic situation. Population growth is projected to remain very high. Demographic pressure from exploding youth population could be both potential and also it's a threat if we didn't use it properly. In Ethiopia, creating jobs means reforms to open up key economic sectors, both for domestic and foreign investment, and also competition and securing sustainable financing to fill the infrastructure deficit. So international community, particularly the international private sector, has to use the potential of Africa and invest in Africa. They need to invest more in the region. We are doing our utmost best to facilitate these investments. There is also a declining trend in concessional financing available to low-income countries, and that needs to be addressed. And I think more concessional financing is needed. Without it, we risk failing to make progress. And I think IMF is best placed to work with international financial institutions so that this could be boosted and addressed well. Thank you, Christine.
Okay. So, Ahmed, what you're saying is that there are demographic pressure that will not go away, a lot of young people population that will require jobs, and given the technological trends that we are seeing, how technologies and finance can be married together to create those jobs in Africa is a key issue for you.
Important, yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Steve, over to you.
Well, let me just say that it's difficult to actually hear what the other panelists are saying. So that, at least we have problems hearing what the other panelists are saying. I just so you know.
Which is why I'm trying to repeat.
Thank you. Do that. We live in actually very interesting and challenging times where I guess rapid movement is surrounding us. And if I were to pick up some trends that stand out, I would say uncertainty as one, because it comes with more protectionism, it comes with the lack of ability to invest, and that kind of course affects global growth. We see the diminishing acceptance of economic interdependence. We see the shifting center of economic gravity in the world. And I also have to mention climate change, because that's something that we all talk about, and we have to find mutual solutions to that. And with all those trends, we see shifts that is actually taking us backwards. And I would say now is the time to stick to liberal values when you see a less liberal world. And I think these are things that we really need to address. We need to work on more integration instead of more barriers, because this is something that we have learned from decades. That has been why we've had such tremendous economic growth in the world, because we have been able to integrate, we have been able to trade together, and now we see these barriers building up. And that will only, it will take away the win-win situation that we have all benefited from. And that's why the uncertainty comes. And I think the reason behind all this is that we seem to blame trade. But that's just a poor excuse for politically inability to even out distribution of income among people. And I think that's a political responsibility within every nation, is actually to even out inequality. And I think that's the main reason behind us seeing more protectionism. But that's just a sorry excuse for lack of tools, political tools within your home state.
Okay. It's interesting that you mentioned the issue of the expectation of speed and of rapid responses and the sense of urgency that you have mentioned as well. Uncertainty, the rise of protectionism, the fact that we would be going backward rather than stick to those sort of market values that have actually helped economies grow over the course of time, and the fact that we need to search in the toolbox better tools in order to include people rather than exclude them. May I turn to, thank you very much, Yiping.
Yes, I like to bring everybody's attention to the implications.
You have our undivided attention. Go ahead.
The implications of the rapidly developing financial technology, the FinTech, for financial efficiency and financial stability. I guess when we talk about FinTech in most developed countries, we think about cryptocurrency and so on. But for developing countries, it's more about efficiency, about access, providing payment, lending, insurance, and wealth management services to disadvantaged groups. I think that's a huge revolution compared to the traditional financial institutions. One of the key features of the FinTech or the big tech company is once you set up a platform, the marginal cost of serving additional customers is almost zero. This is why you have this technological basis for financial inclusion. But the implication of FinTech for financial stability could be quite actually mixed. For instance, on the one hand, you could look at FinTech lending. Most of them are unsecured or uncollateralized, in a way that takes out what Bernanke calls financial accelerator. In fact, it could improve financial stability and economic stability. But on the other hand, the FinTech or big tech companies also introduce new types of risks, things like system failure, cyber attack, or even rapid spreading of the risks. So these are the very complicated stories we need to look at. And I think we probably could have said the same thing for the impact of FinTech for transmission of the monetary policy. It certainly would also pose new challenges for monitoring and regulating cross-border capital flows. So I'd just like to highlight this new development. I think technology is rapidly changing the landscape in the financial industry at both the national and international level. And I suggest this is something that national authorities and international organizations like IMF probably should pay more attention to now.
Okay. So new technologies, particularly applicable in the financial domains, are. You talked mostly about the impact it has on inclusion, access, cost reduction, more so than alternative currency mechanisms and everything that goes with it. And what you seem to say is that technologies are going to change the landscape in that field, but maybe in other fields as well.
Well, also has a very significant implications for financial stability, both positive effect and a negative effect.
Yes.
I think we need to look at the picture as a whole.
Okay, I'm going to just park what you just said, So the impact of technology in monetary transmission, for instance, the expectation of speed,
Right.
and the need for policy advice in that respect. And that points me in the direction of capital flow movements and what we do about it and what our view is and what our advice can be. I thank you very much. If I bring all your views together, I hear a lot of technologies. I hear a lot of sense of urgency, time of the essence, speed at which changes is happening, populism, feeling of exclusion, not enough tools in the toolbox that we're prepared to use, and uncertainty in the background as well. And this urge to respond to flow of either newcomers to the market, population demographic pressure, or migration flows that you've referred to. So that summarizes reasonably okay, your general views. I give you a second chance, John, because you only focused on populism. Do you want to mention something else?
Well, I think it's not just the trends, it's the way they interact. So, for example, you can see the technological trends as we move to a more sort of platform-based economy, and people sort of interact with each other in a kind of much more peer-to-peer way, then that brings financial sector risks of the sort we've done. But it also changes the nature of work, and it changes the labor force, and it changes the relationship between, if you like, employment and inflation. And I think for people involved in macroeconomic management, I mean, these key trends, and I mean, this is an issue for surveillance, these key trends are probably changing the model of the economy that we have.
We're all in search of why inflation is stubbornly low. Do you think it could move in one direction or the other, depending on the use of technology that we do?
I think one of the reasons why, so I don't know.
Neither do we. So
why it's so. Well, at least we know what we don't know, which maybe is a point to come back to under IMF surveillance.
Yep.
I think knowing what you don't know is maybe a good starting point. But it's certainly true that if you're dealing with, for example, firms that produce technological outputs, the marginal cost of extra supply is zero.
Yeah.
So we have a model in our mind of investment and supply and demand and the marginal cost of additional demand and meeting it, which when you're dealing with weightless digital products is very, very different. So the point at which demand starts to put pressure on supply may well have changed because of technology in those parts of the economy that are actually producing technological products.
Okay. Well, all policymakers, including those sitting in the room or those who are advising them, will be facing this wide-ranging set of trends and evolution, and some at an accelerated pace, and some completely transforming the way in which we have worked, we have thought, and considered issues. So there's another word that you've used, which is uncertainty. And for some of those trends, we don't really know. The point that we just discussed about inflation is a point in case. So I would like to ask you, Oksana, in that context of uncertainty and with multiple trends changing the map, how should national policymakers actually approach policy design and formulate policies and communicate policies to keep their economies going and on a level keel?
Thank you. That's, I think, the question for all of us, what to do. And I think the first thing that we always have to remember the basics and always be prepared. So like you said a year ago, the sun is shining, fix the roof.
Yes.
Well, in Ukraine, I mean, our roof was severely damaged before, so we had to do a lot of fixing, obviously. But I think discussing the new trends, we always have to remember the good old recipes. Fiscal consolidation is always good. Prudent debt management is always good. We just reviewed again the debt management strategy in Ukraine and put the target in 3 years to go to 42% as the debt to GDP in 3 years. And we managed to get it to 60%, which is a big achievement for Ukraine now. Focus on prudent fiscal policies. Focus on the revenue mobilization. Do the traditionally good stuff that you would do 20 years, 10 years ago. It's still a good policy to continue doing it. The second big part is, regardless of all these trends, push for reforms. Continue doing all the necessary changes, like in Ukraine. You know, we started the decentralization reform, the healthcare reform, the fiscal, the budgetary, all this reform, regardless of how people react to them. And it always takes time for people to see the results of the reform. And in Ukraine, for example, we had to do some reforms faster, like decentralization that we did in 1 year. It took Poland 10 years to complete the same reform. The budgetary reform, we had to do it in 3 years. It took France more than 10 years to get to the full midterm budgeting, new liquidity management. But you have to stay the course, and you have to show leadership, and you have to focus on the reforms that create new institutions, create resilient institutions, especially in the rule of law sphere, because if you want to protect your reform going forward, you need the stable institutions. We also need, and that's a task, I put it as the task for myself, we need to communicate it. And I think that's in this changing reality, in the changing access to information, in the changing ways people communicate, we need to do extra effort to communicate it to people. Otherwise, we will never find a proper response to this rise in populism. Because we have to, I wouldn't say educate people, but we have to deliver the messages so that they can actually understand and make the informed choices. And the fourth, which is very important for me, and we're working on it a lot, is create inclusive environments and inclusive change. We have started 4 years ago, the gender-oriented budgeting.
Yeah.
And it has proven that we actually improve spending and better use of money when we put a special emphasis on the gender as the very important factor, not just to push for equality, but essentially analyze how we can, what expenditures are related to gender issues and how we can do it better. And then what can we do in order to include women more into the workforce, because that creates additional economic growth. And it definitely creates this. So if we combine this communication, inclusivity, and still doing the regular job with the old-fashioned tools, but combine it with the new, I think there is a chance that we will be able to navigate in this new changing environment.
Okay, I'm going to thank you so much. I'm moving over to you, Siv, just to add on that, because essentially you're saying stick to the old game, make sure that you apply the basics, be prepared, stay the course and accelerate, keep reforming all the time, communicate and include. What else would you add to that, cocktail?
I very much agree with that, actually. I mean, in a world where we need to collaborate more, you still need to keep order back home. You need to make sure that your fiscal policy is good enough, that your monetary policy is good enough, that your labor market is working, that you have a competitive, friendly regulatory framework, that you continuously work on structural reforms, because the economy is constantly changing and you cannot rest. You have to launch new reforms all the time to make sure that your economy is fitted to the challenges that you are facing. And I think that, yes, a lot of us are talking about the technological development and the difficulties that follows with that. Well, I'm a technology optimist, and I think that this is just a different form than what we have seen through history. It's always something that disrupts the economy. And then you need to think differently in order to create jobs. But even with the technology development that you see, you'll still be able to create jobs, but maybe in a different manner in the future. Yeah. And that's why I think that being a competitive, friendly economy is one of the most important things that you can do. Set up a transparent framework and leave the businesses to compete.
Do you feel that there is also a need to anticipate? Because as you say, you're a technology optimist, I know you, and you know that some jobs are gone, some jobs are created, but the anticipation process, we're planning and helping, that plays a role, doesn't it?
Yeah, but if you the Industrial Revolution is, I think it's comparable. A lot of people at the time was scared because they lost their jobs. But the gains from that revolution was
phenomenal,
tremendous. So what will be the gains from today's rapid technological movements? Probably just as big. And I think one gain to that is that we are living in a world where skills is extremely important, and we are putting people to school, making sure that they are skilled enough to meet the future labor market. But at the same time, I think that the technology opens up a job market for less skilled people as well. The new technological platforms that are developing are actually opening up a job market for people that has probably been left outside the labor market for a while.
John, I'm going to turn to you. In view of those imperatives and the time pressure and the multiple tasks that policymakers have, how, in your view, could the fund formulate its policy advice to best support the members that are facing those hard choices and those many priorities on the agenda? And when facing potentially multiple outcomes, some that are less favorable, some that are more favorable, and when there is trade-off, how can we help? And then I will ask you the same question.
But also, if I could just respond
Please.
on the last point about the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, you know about that. It started.
Well, it started, I can't remember it actually that well. I have a faint memory of it, but anyway, it was very smoky. I think what I'd say is the people that lost their jobs lost them before the new jobs came. And it took perhaps 70 to 100 years and some quite difficult passages, including, I think in some cases, war, before we managed to find the right regulatory and social structures to be able to balance out sort of rights and responsibilities. So it was a difficult time. And with the speed that the current industrial revolution is happening, I think we have as policymakers to get onto those regulatory structures, finding the balances that are societally acceptable much, much faster. And particularly around this question of the world of work and automation, which is where a lot of the fear, it comes back to the inclusion point, a lot of the fear comes from. I think if we could get to those structures more quickly than we did in the 19th century, we might avoid an awful lot of stress and turmoil. On fund surveillance, look, first of all, I will confess to something I do remember, which is 15 plus years ago after the Asian crisis. I was part of a UK initiative when a deputy at the Treasury to reform fund surveillance, to give it more traction in its policy advice, but also to bring in the financial sector, but also to expose more diversity of thought around the advice. The idea being that if there was more diversity of thought, it would have more traction. And I'm afraid I haven't completely changed my views in the intervening period. And I'd say two things about how the fund can help. The first is, I mean, the funds are a kind of macroeconomic and now macro-financial firefighting organization, but it's also a surveillance organization. And surveillance is supposed to reduce the probability of firefighting. So it's a key role, and in some ways much more difficult than the firefighting to do. But the key is in what is a macroeconomic or increasingly a macro-financial risk. And sometimes those risks come out of macroeconomic problems, imbalances, macro-financial problems, and policies, and you deal with them there. But sometimes the vector is not macroeconomic or macro-financial. The risk originates somewhere else. In my country at the moment with Brexit, we're seeing a potentially large macroeconomic risk that doesn't actually originate in macroeconomic management or imbalances. And I think the fund has got to analyze the macro-critical risk regardless of the direction it comes from and whether it originates in a kind of macroeconomic, macro-financial world. So that
Can I just stop you, because you're pointing to a very specific case where, while we tried to do that without getting involved in any of the directions that had been selected or were about to be selected, we got quite a bit of pushback in terms of, well, your macroeconomic consequences are predicated on the position that you take ideologically or politically, which certainly was not the case. But because there was so much polarization in the country where the Article 4 was delivered, there was that reaction. So how do we deal with that?
Well, for what it's worth, we're very familiar in the Bank of England with that reaction. I think to some extent it comes back to saying it's our job to point out what the risks are.
Right.
And you have to be quite open about that.
Yeah.
It comes to something else, I think, which is incredibly important, is you have to set out your assumptions. You have to set out the sensitivities and what you based your judgments on, so other people can reach different views if they have different base assumptions and the like. I don't know how people will react, how politicians will react in Brexit, but if I can set out what might happen in certain circumstances.
So scenario planning is not
scenario
a bad
planning,
idea.
yeah, or just making clear on what you've based your advice. I think for the fund, I mean, it has changed in the last 15, 20 years. So we have WEO reports on climate change, on tackling inclusion. Last WEO's got something on the market power of corporates. You know, if the risk comes from outside of the traditional area, provided the fund is advising on the possible macro impact and the macro policy response, I think you should continue in that direction. With these uncertainties, it's useful. And a final point, just going back to this question of uncertainty and coming maybe out of the macroeconomic sphere, we do have these uncertainties about the model of the economy, whether it's a very slow recovery from the debt bust and the financial crisis, or whether technology or other things have changed the structure, and why economic variables are not behaving like they should, and key relationships in the economy don't seem to be as powerful as before. I think in that context, it goes back to the earlier points. You should set out your assumptions, your baselines, test the sensitivity against those. You should make clear what we don't know, what the uncertainties are, and without going into huge scenario planning, how policies, the direction of policies might have to shift if certain things that we don't know were to happen. And the last, which I feel quite strongly about, I think the fund is strong enough to subject its surveillance to other views of the world, because there are many other views of the world, and to test it against that and to make clear it's tested it. I borrowed from Martin Wolf a Mark Twain quote, which is, and I'm paraphrasing it, but it's not what we don't know that gets us into problems, it's what we know that just ain't so. And I think that it's that key point about being, particularly in a world of uncertainty, just being a bit more diverse and a bit more humble about the things we think we know that's important.
So it would be perfectly okay in the course of an Article 4, for instance, to actually say, we've observed all of this and we don't really know what the...
Well, in some cases it's true, but there has to be a balance. I mean, in the end, you know, fund surveillance and policy advice, you have to form a view and you have to give some advice. And clearly an Article 4 that is 300 scenarios and it's all very interesting is not very useful to the fund membership. But I think you can find that balance and still go a bit further in the directions I've been talking about.
Thank you. Ahmed.
Good, thank you. Generally, we have very good dialogue with IMF, and we also appreciate that in recent years, in addition to macroeconomic aggregates, the fund is also looking at quality of policies and implication for economic inequality. Important area where we need IMF advice is on how to make our economies more attractive to private investment.
So we need to be more attractive.
To private investment, yeah. We need a lot of support in terms of those areas. Given the fund's cross-country experience, perspective, particularly on areas of reform which are effective in harnessing private investment and cultivating domestic dynamic market is very important. I also want to encourage the fund to work with multilateral development banks to support developing countries in effort in creating more jobs to the youth. That's very, very important, that the fund should work with other multilateral development financial institutions on addressing the issue of youth employment. The fund also should be more flexible and timely in engagement with members. Several unique factors of each country's perspective has to be considered. Flexibility should be an important aspect of fund's engagement with membership in terms of policy advice, program arrangement, and capacity building to ensure effectiveness of program objectives. Developing countries have unique challenge. Therefore, because of global economic condition, as well as domestic policy constraint, therefore there has to be renewed engagement in terms of supporting developing countries. So given advance in technology and fast-growing economic landscape, there is a need for greater flexibility and timeliness of the fund advice to address different issues that countries are grappling with in terms of job creation and broad-based economic development. It's not only economic transformation, it is broad-based issues that developing countries are grappling with: development of state institutions, economic transformation, population dynamics is very much challenging. Therefore, they need to transform those challenges into advantage. Therefore, there has to be unique, tailored support in that. So country system also should be strengthened. So I think the fund has to work with other financial institutions in helping developing countries address their unique challenge. Thank you.
If I ask you the question, is our advice timely enough, or should we move faster? Should we be giving more repeated sequences of advice? What do you say?
I think flexibility is the most important one.
Flexibility.
Flexibility to understand each country context, specific context has to be considered, because least developing countries, like countries in Africa, are moving in complex development challenges, addressing political development, economic development, socio-economic transformations. Therefore, the context-specific advice, timeliness, and flexibility is really important. And working with other international financial institutions in helping those countries to get sustainable financing, for example, concessional financing issues, has to be addressed in terms of creating jobs, because that is really a big challenge. Thank you.
Okay. I take your point, but it's sometimes difficult to actually marry that expectations of flexibility and the principle of even-handedness. But it's even-handedness, everything being equal. And clearly, we have to be very mindful of special circumstances, depending on the category of countries and depending on the country itself. That's clear. Yeah. Yiping, I'm turning to you now. Given the potential social tensions, such as unemployment, inequality, climate change, and their potential to affect domestic or balance of payment stability, should the fund continue to broaden its focus on sustainability in our surveillance work? What do you think?
Well, my sense is in 2 points. Number one, obviously, if I understand correctly, the fund's main mandate is still to maintain economic and financial stability. So the other issues, whether inequality, unemployment, or climate change, might come to your attention only if they affect economic and financial stability. But it did in the past. So for instance, inequality or unemployment could affect the policymakers and the whole society's attitude towards globalization, economic and financial policy. So yes, I think I agree that the fund probably should broaden its scope of and focus on these broader set of issues. But the second issue I think is more important is what kind of policy tools we look at. Yeah. The reason why I think we had some problems before, for instance, the populism or other political issues, is because there are people left behind in the process of globalization. In a way, you could think that as a result of market failure. Just leave it to a free market, it wouldn't solve all the problems. So that, I think, caused for a more big question about the division of labor between the government and the market. And specifically, I like to emphasize the issue of the so-called state capitalism. In general, my understanding is the fund would regard government interventions in resource allocation as negative policy action. But in reality, I think you look at many different countries, countries with very different experiences, the East Asian economies, which have been more successful in the post-war period, in general have much more proactive governments. Do we think that's acceptable, that's favorable, or that's just the result we just have to accept? And I think that's more related to issues that free market mechanism would not be able to effectively deal with these issues. Then perhaps there's a room for the government to play a more critical role. My own research about the financial reform, for instance, you look at the financial repression, which means the government intervenes in the financial system. In China, the number is very high globally. So as an economist, I would immediately say, that's bad and you need to change. But you put together remarkable economic growth and the financial stability with the kind of policy intervention in the past, and you make a judgment what is actually the best. I actually think, to some extent, repressive financial policies helped to support economic growth and financial stability in China during the early stage of reform, because the market was not well developed, the regulatory system was not effective. You can imagine if China opened up the financial system, liberalized the financial system 40 years ago, we would have experienced the numbers of financial crises already, I think. So this just gives me, makes me to think, maybe we need to be more realistic about what the government can do in addressing some of the issues you mentioned earlier on. And we might need to be careful about labeling something like state capitalism. What is probably important is not what we think this is good or it's bad, but what is important to lay the principles and the guidelines that what the government should follow, even if they intervene in economic activities.
So we should focus on what the ultimate outcome will be, adopt as comprehensive an approach as possible, and if I understood you correctly, does that also mean that you look at those options with a focus on your domestic market, on your own economy, or do you look at that and how it spills over to the rest of the world and what the interactions will be?
Well, certainly we should look at more in a global scale, because almost no economy's policy would have just the impact on domestic economy alone. But here, I think there's also a distinction between ordinary countries and systemically important countries. Yeah. When you have systemically important countries, whatever policy they make will have a spillover effect. In fact, this is one of the areas where IMF, I think, should strengthen its policy advices. You look at the last few years, the QE policies by the Fed and the ECB had a major impact on the rest of the world. But we really, other countries are not in a position to request or to ask for coordination with these important countries' central banks. To a less extent, my observation is that China's PBOC's monetary policy also start to have some kind of spillover effect on the other neighboring countries. So I do think this is an area for IMF to look at in the future, that how do we advise the policy making in systemically important countries, especially in considering the potential spillover effects.
Fascinating. I'm going to ask each of you your sense about that proposition.
On that last point, I think it's not just spillovers that we need to understand, it's spillbacks. Mm-hmm. So I think it's quite difficult. We have a global economy, but national jurisdictions, or in the EU, regional jurisdictions. So it's quite difficult to ask central banks who have a national mandate to think about others. What I think they can...
What Yiping is suggesting is that the IMF have a say in that respect.
But but what I think the IMF can do, and what would help in this, is just the analysis of how a spillover from country A to countries B, C, and D spills back to country A, because then in the policy analysis, you can act. And as the world becomes more interconnected and we have these flows coming backwards and forwards, it is, I think actually the spillbacks, as the emerging world becomes a larger part of the world economy and starts to accumulate wealth and investment flows, become much more important. So if the fund has a better, or can provide a better analysis of, if you like, the supply of capital flows, demand, and the channels through which they move, and how the problems come back to you, then it's much easier to get that action. And I think we are all more connected than we think we are. So there's quite a way to go.
We saw that in 2015, and we've seen
I think that's a very important point. You look at both spillover effects and the spillback effect. My worry is that the spillback effect is far less important. That's why the policymakers don't pay enough attention. If the two effects are equal, then I guess it's much easier to ask for coordination.
Or it may be as important, but less well understood.
Right, true, true.
All right, that's an area where we have to do a bit of homework then. Okay. Unless you have views on that particular topic, I'd like to move to you, Steve, and ask you how we can collectively, us in our surveillance mission, trying to generate as much international cooperation amongst our membership, how can we promote more sustainable growth going forward?
From the fund's perspective, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think the fund should stick to its strengths. And that is to being analytically strong. I think that's extremely important. Mm-hmm. And also that the fact that you are independent and very candid towards the people in power. You need to stick to that. And I think that your ability to give attentive response to members without being moralistic. I think those are three very important criteria, but I also think the fund should go further with its engagement. And when I say this, I don't mean that the fund should duplicate what other organizations do, but I actually think that the fund should look more into areas like financial regulation, tax, illicit capital flows, because these are topics on the agenda all the time, and the fund could play a role in this without duplicating the work done by the OECD or other organizations. Something that we talk about all the time is how find solutions to tax digital companies. We discuss this all the time and we don't find a solution. Mm-hmm. But this is just another example of how we need to find an international solution to this problem, because if we go unilateral on this, it will only collapse. That's at least my view. And so the work is proceeding through the OECD, and I don't think you should duplicate that, but you should take your way into those debates, and I think the fund has an important role to play in that. So expanding a little bit in those directions, I think, would be important, especially since you wear this independent role, and that comes with a lot of credibility.
Actually, I'm very strongly in support of your point, and the fund just very recently published a paper on international corporate taxation that focuses precisely on the new concepts that we need to develop and explore. Not that we are prescribing anything, but that will be actually looking at the entire international community, not just a few, but what it means for all countries, including the low-income countries that are leaving a lot of tax on the table in that process. So yes, we just recently published, we're going to keep at it. That's a good one. Now, I realize that time is short and limited. I would like to take one particular item, which is, you raised it, you, Ahmed, raised it as well, and it's those new technologies. And new technologies applied to the world of finance in particular, but not only, both for advanced economies and for developing countries as well as emerging market economies. You are aware of the Bali agenda, which was the Bali FinTech agenda that President Jokowi asked us to concentrate on and to offer a series of an agenda, he called it, so that all countries could look at what was needed in terms of supervision, in terms of access, in terms of purpose. What else and what more can we do to help our membership either reap the benefits of this or identify the costs and the risk about FinTech? We are working hard in that field. We have a very good and solid advisory group, which includes private sector representatives and public actors as well. What else and what more can we do? Because we are seeing it actually changing the map of finance.
Well, I think it's a very complicated story, but I will only make 2 points. One thing I think is very important is to find a balance between innovation and stability. A lot of FinTech activities are new business models, and sometimes it creates a lot of value. But it could also be disruptive if we're not careful enough. So I think what we need to do is trying to find a balance between the two. And at the back of it really is how do we regulate these innovative activities, and one of the common practice is the so-called sandboxes. I mean, UK is the pioneer in it. Singapore, Thailand, they're all trying to do it. I think IMF could play a role in here, trying to find a common framework that might be applicable in various ways in different places. So that's at the national level, I think IMF could help, certainly for a lot of developing countries. At the international level, I think there are also need for, at some stage, unify the regulatory standard. So for instance, the data. Yeah. How do we balance the efficiency of big data analysis and the protection of privacy? Because it's very important for FinTech industry, probably even more so than others. If the regulatory standards are not equal globally, you will see lots of arbitrage and risks emerging. And so I think this is also one critical area IMF probably can facilitate discussion, at least the dialogue, gradually bring the standards into a uniform.
That's a huge, big job, because we're clearly seeing regions rallying around and behind key principles which are not
Christy, we have to start somewhere.
You certainly point your finger on it, Yiping. Thank you so much. Ahmed, and then...
I would like to come on issue of new technologies. Within the perspective of least developed countries and countries like Ethiopia and Africa, new technology are very important for economic growth and development, but also we need to be mindful of, we need to create many jobs with population pressure and youth population. So job creating technologies are really very fundamental and very important. So we need to balance in terms of job creation technologies are very important also.
Okay, thank you, Ahmed. Oksana?
Yes, I would like to support that idea that with innovations and technologies, we as policymakers and regulators will always be behind. We just have to accept it. We will be catching up with the regulations, but innovations will be developing faster. And I think the fund has a unique role here, where we can use the fund as the platform to discuss it and develop at least, some, not even guidance, but the common principles and frameworks that then we can, at the national level, discuss it and implement it into regulations or not implement it. But I think we can use the fund as the common discussion independent table, because when we discuss some of the technological breakthroughs like blockchain and others, obviously the national governments sometimes will not even be ready to discuss it with each other, because whatever can be a challenge for one nation will be a competitive advantage for another. But the fund has been in this advisory role, and the independent role will be a very good platform for us to get together and discuss the ideas and develop the frameworks.
That's really interesting. So, okay. Siv, any view on that?
I agree also, because I think that we have just set up a sandbox on FinTech as well. And we are looking for other countries' experiences. So we are looking to the UK, because they have come a little bit further than we have. So maybe we should look into this on a more international level, because we're all facing these challenges and opportunities as well. And so the sandbox is sort of a precaution that you take to try to figure out how to go further on it. But there are opportunities there, but we need to learn from each other. So instead of going bilaterally all the time, we maybe should work in a more international scope.
Really interesting what you are all mentioning about sandboxes, because we had a roundtable in, I think it was in Dubai, on the issue of sandboxes. And there were quite a few participants who were saying there should be a framework for sandboxes, because what we are seeing is new startups setting up shop in a particular sandbox, doing their job, wrapping up after 1 year, trying another sandbox somewhere else. And they were saying, we are wasting some resources in supporting that kind of process. So take that point.
Just as a regulator, including of some of this activity. I'd make 2 points. One, if we want to avoid fragmented regulation, because we're all responding at different speeds to this, there needs to be more. It may not need international standards at some point, but just more discussion of who is doing what, because very often the fragmentation, the barriers get baked in almost unintentionally because of the way regulation develops within national systems. So there is a role. There's a role for the fund. There's also standard setters and a whole FSB world as well. But I think the fund should work together and can actually, it's got a very big membership and can reach that. The other point I'd make, which is a slightly nerdy point, if I can be forgiven, much of our regulation and supervision is based on entities and has been formed around big banks, big insurance companies from a prudential point of view. And when it comes to the sort of more disaggregated market activities, the regulation is about investor protection and the like. And what's happening now with FinTech is the kind of financial production chain is being sliced up into lots of activities being done in different places by different people. We need to develop, I think we'll need to develop a much sort of stronger activity-based approach to regulation and supervision, rather than if I can get my arms around 20 big global banks, I've got the systemic risk covered.
Right.
And I think that's really a big challenge. And the fund, I think, has a role also in disseminating and kind of helping with that.
And we look back to flexibility. Yes. We have to look at those issues in terms of development of activity much more so than trying to focus on entities. Now, I made you a promise, and I want to deliver. If any one of you has a burning question, please come to the mic and ask it.
Okay, then we leave.
Time is up. Sorry. Thank you.